comes to us from the legends of Plato. Many of you have probably heard about the Timaeus and the Cretus, but I'm going to just briefly go over how this story came to be embedded in human history and be taken seriously by so many people, even people who are very, grounded, rational thinkers that are not mystical. So the legends of Atlantis were passed down as a story that was told by an Egyptian high priest to the Greek statesman Solon. And we know that Solon actually was a great Greek citizen that visited and spent time in Egypt. So that corresponds with known history. Plato sets the time of the meeting of the four men at Cretus's house in June of 421 BC. The Timaeus, which is one of his writings, begins on the day following the debate recorded in one of his other books, The Republic, and the men start by recalling their previous conversation. Then Hermocrates mentions a story derived from ancient tradition that only Cretus knows. Pressed for details, Cretus recalls how a century and a half earlier, the great Athenian statesman Solon had visited Egypt. So we do know Solon was a real person. He visited Egypt around 590 BC, and while in Cayce, which was a great Egyptian oracle center, even more famous in the time than the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, they had close ties with Athens. A group of priests told Solon the story of Athens, a tale Plato tells us in his book that, though strange, is certainly true. Solon made notes of the conversation and intended recording the story for posterity, but he did not do so. Instead, he told the story to a relative, Dropides, who passed it on to his son, Cretus the elder, who eventually told his grandson, another man named Cretus. This is the man who is featured in Plato's book, The Dialogues. In the Timaeus, Cretus gives a brief account of what the priest told Solon. According to ancient Egyptian records, had been a great Athenian empire some 9,000 years earlier, about 9600 BC. At the same time, there was the mighty empire of Atlantis that was located on a large island or a continent west of the Pillars of Hercules. Now, this is actually a real map of Atlantis. In its last incarnation, it had earlier incarnations, and it was quite large. It was said to be the size of North Africa plus Asia Minor put together. So it wasn't some little dinky island. It was actually a very large landmass. This is what we now call the Mid-Atlantic Ridge that goes through it. And we're going to take a look at that ridge and how it got fractured. It's fractured today. So this was a huge mountain range. This is another mountain range. The city of Poseidia was here. This is where the three concentric circles were. And this is actually a map that was drawn by my friends in Damanhur. Damanhur, Italy is a place that I've been going since 1999. They're really incredible community. They're about an hour north of the city of Turin in northwestern Italy. And they have gone back in time, actually physically gone back in time to ancient Atlantis, but they could not take clothes, they could not take cameras, they couldn't take anything. They had to go totally naked. And of course, as soon as they were there, they had to get some clothes, but they wound up going to the museums. And there are some images here that were painted by a very famous painter that they took with them on this trip, and they were gone for 3 days and 3 nights. And when they came back, he painted 22 images. And so some of the images that I will show you are images from his paintings that were firsthand eyewitness to what Atlantis looked like. And I'll actually indicate those in this presentation. So at the same time, there was the mighty empire of Atlantis, located on a large island west of the Pillars of Hercules. So the Pillars of Hercules are the Straits of Gibraltar. So on a current map, here is southern Spain and here's Morocco. This is the Mediterranean Sea that leads into where Greece is and Italy and so forth. These are the Straits of Gibraltar between Spain and Morocco here. And so this is what it looked like when you went out to sea. They were called the Pillars of Hercules. And these straits were very narrow, and it was a very big deal for ships to go through them. So Edgar Cayce tells us much the same story, confirming Plato's account and filling in some gaps in our hidden history. So this is what he says. He says Atlantis basically had 4 basic incarnations. It was a huge continent that took up most of the Atlantic Ocean, and we're going to be looking at some pictures of that crustal plate. And it really came up around 100,000 years ago. And in fact, at that time, there was an incarnation of Jesus that was called Emilius. And he had, of course, the male and the female Christ. The female Christ at that time was called Lilith. And of course, we know Lilith has been demonized by the patriarchy because, you know, the silly story that she wouldn't lie in the missionary position and sleep with Adam. And so they have run her off and put Eve in her place. All that is just total BS. So Emilius and Lilith were the incarnations of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, of the male and the female Christ, that came around 100,000 years ago and really helped to seed a lot of the higher consciousness in that civilization. And it lasted a really long time. But around 51,000 years ago, as we're going to see, there was a big disaster that took place, and they lost a huge section, and it broke up that continent into 5 large land masses or bodies with some smaller islands. And that lasted from about 51,000 to about 28,000 years. So they rebuilt. And through both of these situations, although the children of the law of one, the more positive individuals were the ruling group, the darker forces continued to contend and try to take power whenever they could. And at certain times they got the upper hand. And so then there was another big disaster. So after this disaster, there were 3 large island continents with smaller islands, and between 28,000 and 22,000 years ago, a number of these went down until finally that last one was left. One large island continent, and this is the one that was the size of North Africa and Asia Minor, and then that one existed from 22,000 to 12,000 years ago. And so we're going to look at how that history plays out. So now this is what Cayce tells us. He says that there was a first root race, which was not really the kind of Homo sapien that we have today, that came in about 10.5 million years ago. He says that this was the precursors to Lemuria, and that these spirits were not fully incarnated in the physical form, and that they went in and out of all sorts of creatures, animals, elements, primitive people, and so forth, but eventually they kind of got stuck. So then the powers that be said, well, what can we do? And so there was a second wave that came in about 500,000 years afterwards. This is around 10 million years ago. These spirits had more human bodies and with greater variety. And there are many of the versions that we see in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. There were dwarfs, and there were hobbits, and there were, you know, giants, and of course some of the kinds that traditional anthropology has discovered, like Peking man or Australopithecus or whatever, Cro-Magnon. But there were a lot of different varieties, and there could very easily have actually been, you know, something similar to kind of a Homo sapien. Finally, there was another influx, and the third and the fourth root races that came in around 210,000 years BC. Now, this is, of course, what kind of goes along with the Anunnaki information, that the Anunnaki basically kind of jump-started our DNA and created a more perfect man. So this is when the Atlantean experiment began, and more perfected human bodies were created around 200,000 years, but more androgynous, and that the 2 distinct sexes were created around 100,000 years ago. So in other words, there was a period of time when there were beings on this planet that were, you know, hermaphroditic. Of course, one of the challenges about that is that the sex drive, even though we can see it's created a lot of problems in our society, it is a drive to merge with another person. And really the real merger, as we know, is with the heart and with the spirit and with love. But the hormones take over when we have 2 sexes and drive us to find someone that we can share our life with. And of course, that leads to all sorts of interesting lessons and challenges and complications, but it also has rich rewards to it. And then the fourth root race, according to Edgar Cayce, is what we know as modern mankind and known history. Now, there's some channel material that says something very similar. And this channel material actually comes from Stuart Wilson and Joanne Prentice in a book where they are speaking with this high-level angel, L'Oreal. And he actually gives a timeline that is very close to Edgar Cayce's. You can sort of see pretty much the same thing, explaining how spirits came down here initially for fun. They got trapped, and then other spirits came to help them. They got trapped, and so forth and so on. And eventually they had to create, it was at the time of Emilius, that they tried to create a more perfected human body for spirits to be in. And that is, of course, the version that we have today that we're inhabiting. So let's take a look at Atlantis and some of the legends. It was a very beautiful culture. It had gorgeous architecture. It had pools and fountains and lakes and rivers. It had mountains. It had incredible gardens and parks. It was magical in every way, very, very beautiful. It was a seagoing culture, and they had aerial vehicles, and including eventually planes, what we think of as planes or like UFOs. It was a pyramid culture, although there were a lot of other kinds of temples and other kinds of buildings. They were very, very creative. And I want to actually show you some pictures here. This is actually a remnant of real Atlantis. This is in the Azores, and we're going to discover shortly that they have now found pyramids underwater that went down around 22,000 years ago. But the Azores are still above water, and this is what Atlantis looked like. It was really just stunningly beautiful. Look at the flora and the fauna. This is actually not, this is a painting, so this is not a real photograph. But I'll be showing you some more pictures of the Azores. They had transportation, they had subways and technology, they had airplanes, and they were not using, they were using crystals and water as a source of energy. They had managed to harness hydraulics. It was a spacefaring technology. In its heyday, it was having visitors from the Pleiades, from the Orion system, from Andromeda, from the Sirius system, the Anunnaki. There were a number of different seafaring cultures that came and visited. So Atlantis actually reached a pinnacle where it became a star capital. And there were these huge landing ports. Now, this is one of those paintings that was done from my friends in Damanhur, Italy, and they're stunning. If you look closely, this is a ship in a harbor, and this is actually a gigantic man, and there's actually repair going on here, scaffolding. So there would probably be, this would be like some kind of an elevator. You would go up his body, which is doubtlessly hollow. There's like a restaurant at the top, and there's a landing platform up here. You can see how this is a landing platform. So here again, gigantic anthropomorphic energies, because they realized that humankind could become the perfected human, the Adam Kadmon that we know of as the Kabbalist, you know, the being that actually has reached their full potential. And here's another one. Here's a woman, and here's the flat platform for the planes. You can sort of see the planes here. Pretty interesting. This is another one from my friends in Damanhur. They had submarines. They don't quite look like our submarines, but they were underwater here, quite lit up. They had submersible capsules. This is a statue of Poseidon with his horses. They had underwater bases. And even today, we see ETs coming, or UFOs coming out of the water. Instead of UFOs, I think they call them, anyway, they're unknown submersible subs. So something very similar to that. So where do these bases come from? They had probably been around since the time of Atlantis. They had mastered a kind of technology that we are just beginning to understand. They were working with crystals, and they had learned how to harness these crystals to generate power in a way that did not pollute the environment, which is something that would behoove us to learn. We are now using crystals in watches for batteries, also with computers, and so we're just beginning to learn how to use crystals once again. But these crystals were used as storage devices for memory, as amplification devices for energy. We're tuning in at consciousness levels. The temples were very beautiful, and they had beings, priests or priestesses, and also very high beings that had come down here either from other star systems that were very advanced, that were helping to oversee the slow evolution of humanity. In many ways, humanity was like, they were like children. They were very creative. They were open. They were more or less joyous societies by and large, telepathic societies, playful societies. They weren't as structured as we are in our time. However, they were also young in terms of their spiritual evolution. And so there was a period of time in one of the last great experiments in Atlantis was to really have Poseidon and his 10 sons and their wives oversee the spiritual growth and evolution through different provinces of Atlantis.